The next presenter is Bo Chamberlin. He's a doctoral student in the Department of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University. So he was a student leader in Amnesty International and later worked on Connecticut's successful campaign to abolish the death penalty before moving to teach English and literature at a Jesuit-run high school in the Federated States of Micronesia. So as a Jesuit novice seminarian, he began investigating the history of Jesuit involvement in the enslavement of African people and left the Jesuits to pursue a second bachelor's in Black Studies from Cleveland State University, and then a master's degree at Temple. So his research focuses on Afrocentric criticism of the culture of white supremacy. He is interested in intellectual history and the legacy of racial metaphor in religion, aesthetics, and philosophy. His work has appeared in the Journal of Black Studies, and he is the recipient of the Molefi Asante Award for Afrocentric Scholarship. So help me to welcome Bo Chamberlin. Hello.
Hello, thank you for having me. It is really an honor to be on such an incredible program. So I really appreciate it. And thank you to all the organizers of the conference for all of your work. I'm going to be reading a paper, Barbarian Logic, Genocide, Pan-African Criticism, and the Unspeakable Nation. So let me begin. In 1933, the Polish legal scholar Raphael Lemkin planned to travel to Madrid to defend a proposal he'd written for the League of Nations to outlaw two crimes that he called barbarity and vandalism. Barbarity referred to the destruction of what he called somewhat loosely a national or religious collectivity, and vandalism referred to the destruction of such a collectivity's works of culture. This was to be his first attempt at introducing into international law concepts aimed at preventing and punishing the destruction of peoples. By his own recounting, he was ultimately prevented from attending the conference when a Warsaw newspaper accused him of using his office as a public prosecutor to influence laws meant solely for the protection of my own race. Lemkin went on to encapsulate what he had once called barbarity and vandalism in a single term, genocide, and to spend his life advocating for its interdiction in international law, lobbying for its inclusion in the indictments of the Nuremberg trials, and for the ratification of the Genocide Convention. The charge that his legal innovation was so specific that it was meant solely to protect his own race would prove ominous. Lemkin begins his autobiography expressing the horror he experienced in his youth upon reading of the destruction of Christians under Roman Emperor Nero in Henryk Sienkiewicz's novel Quo Vadis. I became so fascinated with this story, he writes, that I looked up all the similar instances in history, like the destruction of Carthage, of the Huguenots, of Catholics in Japan, of so many Europeans by Genghis Khan. In lobbying diplomats on the ratification of the Genocide Convention, Lemkin made frequent use of historical examples of genocide to prove the concept was far-reaching enough to merit its own law. His recountings of these conversations are filled with reference to classical Europe and the Hebrew Bible, alongside Japanese Christians in the 17th century and Europeans under Genghis Khan. Lemkin's usage of the terms barbarity and vandalism, with their resonances from classical Europe and the often mythologized sack of Rome, reflect an intellectual trend that became pronounced in the wake of the Holocaust. As the full extent of the horrors of the Holocaust came to be more widely known and more readily believed, the unspeakable nature of this horror suggested to many something of a past so primordial as to escape description except by reference to a history that had already taken on the status of myth. Barbarism, and a family of terms closely related to it, served as grist for the mill of the Frankfurt School's philosophical reckoning with the Enlightenment tradition, made their way into the indictments of the Nuremberg war criminals in the indictments of Nazi war criminals in Nuremberg, and as this paper argues, continued to shape contemporary understandings of and approaches to the phenomenon of genocide. Western thought about barbarians has two fundamental orientations. The first of these is towards the outside. This is continuous with the classical Greek and Roman usage of the term, but not entirely so. As Patrick J. Geary argues in The Myth of Nations, though the term may have been one of mild opprobrium in classical antiquity, federated armies of non-Romans in the Roman Empire nonetheless accepted barbarian as a more or less neutral marker of their non-Roman identity. The change came with the unification of Europe under Christendom and the declining influence of the Roman Empire. By the 7th and 8th centuries of the Common Era, barbarian came to mean foreigner and was increasingly associated with a stereotypical paganism. Perhaps even more notably, the traditional opposition Roman/barbarian disappeared. Barbarian became a term of reproach with an indeterminate signifier that stood in an oppositional relationship with yet another, even more indeterminate self. To call someone a barbarian in Europe after the 8th century was to reproach them for their difference. But what kind of difference was it? In post-Enlightenment Europe, the term barbarian came increasingly to stand in opposition to something called civilization. Enlightenment philosophy was intimately tied to a teleological understanding of historical progress, in which epoch supplants epoch as it marches onward and upward from a mythic darkness into the light of quote-unquote civilization. This second fundamental orientation of Western thought about barbarians is more complex because, while directed inward toward Europe and the European past, it is also more broadly directed to the whole of human history and the mythic ascent from the darkness of savagery and barbarism into the light of civilization. Civilization cut across what had once been a more straightforward divide between Romans and barbarians, and the new barbarism did as well. Indeed, the ascent from barbarism to civilization was believed to be so deeply written into the history of humanity that all human beings must relive it in their own lifetime, climbing from the untamed savagery of childhood into the disciplined, if conflicted, light of adolescence and adulthood. Through their claim to have inherited the arc of civilization, European intellectuals also laid claim to classical Greece and Rome, even while recognizing that they themselves, in many cases, were the descendants of the same barbarians who had laid siege to the classical world. Civilization was both an imperative claimed through action and an inheritance thought to spring from the cultural genius of a particular time, place, and people. It was in this imperative sense that early Pan-African nationalists spoke of African civilization. To the minds of 19th century Pan-African thinkers, Martin Delany, Alexander Crummell, Edward Wilmot Blyden, and others, civilization was the inheritance of Europe. Diasporic African communities had gained civilization through the scourge of enslavement and stood ideally suited to the work of civilizing Africa and redeeming the legacy of African people throughout the world. Their visions of Africa mirrored that of the colonial powers and reflected Eurocentric prejudices to a startling degree. As Alexander Crummell wrote of Africa in 1860, darkness covers the land and gross darkness the people. Nonetheless, even Crummell believed that African civilization would reflect a uniquely African character. This idea found expression in Blyden's Black personality movement, which stood for, quote, the sum of values of African civilization, the body of qualities which make up the distinctiveness of the people of Africa. While often reflecting a Eurocentric view of Africa, Blyden believed, quote, if we are to make an independent nation, a strong nation, we must listen to the songs of our unsophisticated brethren as they sing their history. The apparent contradiction between historical progress and the idealization of the past goes to the heart of Western thought about barbarism. The term barbarian today has an apparently technical sense in which it refers to certain ethnic groups of ancient Europe. In this sense, barbarian denotes nothing pejorative, though it carries an unavoidable pejorative connotation. Aside from this, there is the usage of barbarism that is almost strictly one of opprobrium. Finally, there is a usage of barbarism that is almost always at least half jest, if not completely insincere, in which barbarism denotes freedom from the confines of the civilized world, as in surrealism and European primitivist art. These conflicted usages are in large part the inheritance of 18th and 19th century European nationalist philosophy and historiography, and are more broadly the fruit of post-Enlightenment Europe. In his classic criticism of Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Chinua Achebe writes, quote, "Africa is to Europe as the picture is to Dorian Gray, a carrier onto whom the master unloads his physical and moral deformities so that he may go forward erect and immaculate." Over the long centuries of European enslavement of African people and colonization of Africa, a complex process emerged by which Europeans repeatedly projected their self-understanding onto Africa and the non-European world, developing terminology that reflected what they believed they were seeing of people who they believed inhabited a European conception of childhood, of the childhood of humanity, the primal darkness in which all of humanity, including Europe, once dwelled. This terminology, developed in the colonial encounter, took on a life of its own in Europe and the pan-European world, where it served as a basis for social theory that manages to carry its colonial origins, if only by implication. The examples of this process are too numerous to count, but to take just one, the term fetish originated in the 15th and 16th centuries among Portuguese sailors on the west coast of Africa. An apparent description of religious objects, the term came to be theorized as fetishism by the French writer and linguist Charles de Brosses in his 1760 work on the worship of fetish gods, where he wrote, quote, "Fetishism owes its birth to a time when people were pure savages, plunged in ignorance and barbarism. And, quote, some nations have remained in this unformed state up to the present. Their customs, their ideas, their reasoning, and their practices are those of children. And finally, quote, in general, there is no better method to pierce the veils of the little-known points in antiquity than to observe whether somewhere before our eyes, something quite similar is still occurring." The influence of the concept fetishism, traceable to de Brosses and the perceptions of Portuguese sailors in Africa, can be found in Marx's critique of commodity fetishism and Freud's analysis of fetishism as sexual perversion. The word conjures a mythic past and a horrifying present without any specific reference to the European perceptions of Africa from which it is derived. Without always following the same exact historical genealogy, there is nonetheless a wealth of concepts in Western social theory that carry the legacy of colonial perception into contemporary social criticism. With his long-standing interest in historical philology, Lemkin's understanding of culture and nation was shaped by the German tradition of comparative linguistics and by the thought of such figures as Johann Gottfried von Herder and Wilhelm von Humboldt. Regarded as the forerunners of cultural relativism, the writings of Herder and Humboldt betray the contradictions that have continued to dog cultural relativism to the present. While Herder poetically decried the judgment of historical epics as unfounded, he nonetheless located them in a developmental scheme in which succeeding epics hatefully cast off their forerunners, writing in the late 18th century, quote, "The Egyptian without Oriental childhood instruction would not be an Egyptian. The Greek without Egyptian school diligence, not a Greek. Precisely their hate shows their development, progress, steps of the ladder." Humboldt is similarly contradictory when he extols the virtues of linguistic diversity, while at the same time arguing that some languages are more suited to thinking than others, and thereby express a people's national urge towards thought. Not surprisingly, this sort of national urge is, in Humboldt's scheme, concentrated in Europe. Years later, the father of American anthropology, Franz Boas, an influential cultural relativist and fellow student of Humboldt's writing, condemned racial prejudice in the mind of primitive man. He argued that the superior achievements of the white race were not an indicator of superior attitude, leaving the concept of superiority strikingly intact. Similarly, even while writing the detailed analysis in which Lemkin first defined the concept of genocide in terms of the Nazi occupation of Europe, he also wrote, quote, "It required a long period of evolution in civilized society to mark the way from the wars of extermination which occurred in ancient times and in the Middle Ages to the conception of wars as being essentially limited to activities against armies and states. In Lemkin's formulation, the crime of genocide was at least in part not only a crime of fighting a war of extermination, but a crime of doing so in the wrong epoch of history." In Time and the Other, How Anthropology Creates Its Object, Johannes Fabian analyzed the way in which anthropological discourse defines human societies as objects through the imposition of terminology that subtly enacts temporal distance. Quote, "Labels that connote temporal distancing need not have explicitly temporal references, such as cyclical or repetitive. Adjectives like mythical, ritual, or even tribal will serve the same function." Fabian explains that denial of coevalness is, quote, "a persistent and systematic tendency to place the reference of anthropology in a time other than the present of the producer of anthropological discourse," end quote. This denial of coevalness is far from being limited to anthropology. Similarly subtle temporal mechanisms are often at work in global discourse about human rights abuses and genocide. Language that is laden with temporal connotation, such as the terms savage, tribal, and of course barbaric, are regularly used to describe horrors that are said to be unspeakable and the mentality behind the commission of atrocities. Far from being merely descriptive, this language also posits its object. As Fabian puts it, we do not find the savagery of the savage or the primitivity of the primitive. We posit them. Studies of the history of racism seldom focus their attention on the language used to condemn racism in the interwar period, and especially after the Second World War, or what was at stake in the retrospective definition and condemnation of a phenomenon that has been a fixture of Western culture for centuries, if not millennia. It has been argued that among the first usages to indicate a negative connotation attaching to race and racial identification were in condemning something called race consciousness, race feeling, or racialism among striking subjects of the British Empire. In this understanding, a consciousness or feeling of racial resentment had the dangerous potential to erupt into a rebellion against British rule, which, at least in the eyes of British rule supporters, was synonymous with such things as liberty, equality, and civilization. Feelings of racial solidarity in this sense were imputed with a decidedly regressive character that was typically attributed by colonial administrators to colonized subjects. This condemnation through the positing of racism's regressive character can still be seen in terminology laden with temporal connotation, tribe, irrational, superstitious, unscientific, that continues to accompany the description, definition, and condemnation of contemporary racism. I argue that this time-laden language serves to obscure rather than clarify the processes at work in racism, violations of human rights, and genocide. Lemkin was far from out of step with his time in using terms such as race, nation, national group, religious group, and people almost interchangeably. Focused as he was on how such groups are destroyed, he left it mostly to others to address how such groups are created and defined. One result of the post-war emphasis on deconstruction of such group identities was a change in terminology that has retrospectively obscured the wide influence of what we might call, as opposed to racism, racial thinking. Scholars in a wide array of fields relied on race in conceptualizing phenomena that sometimes had a very clear connection to what we now call racism and sometimes did not. In cases where the shift is clear, a historical connection with what we now call racism is obscured, as in the shift from race hygiene to population health. In other cases, the connection may appear more disparate even when it is apparent, as in the regular usage of the supposed capacity to identify races of people by appearance as an analog to explain the grouping of like phenomena in the development of the notion of scientific objectivity. This linguistic vigilance about explicitly racial language has, with time and political struggle, played its part in producing substantive political changes, such as the removal of explicitly racial quotas from immigration law. But it has also brought about a complexity that can leave contemporary opponents of racism and genocide to feel that we are wandering on the haunted grounds of a history we can never escape, living a peace that is at best doomed by ghosts who will always reappear in many forms, and at worst, not peaceful at all. One of the things Lemkin undoubtedly took from the linguistic philosophies of Herder and Humboldt was the sense that there was something intangible, even spiritual, that makes what he vaguely called a national group unique. There is something similarly intangible in the destruction of such a group. In her work, Let the Circle Be Unbroken, The Implications of African Spirituality in the Diaspora, the Afrocentric scholar Marimba Ani uses the term maafa, meaning disaster in Kiswahili, to name the destruction wrought by, quote, a set of interlocking mechanisms and patterns that function to deny the validity of an African humanity. In Pan-African thought broadly construed, the question of what it means for someone or something to be African has been the subject of considerable debate. The question has a particular significance in the African diaspora, where it not only denotes a present identification, but also posits a connection to a past that is often denied. What I have attempted to demonstrate in this paper is that language used to define not only genocide, but racism and violations of human rights often does so by consigning them to a time that is mythically past. As the ongoing sufferings of the African diaspora witness, this past is in fact ever present. Ideological formations that undermine the tangible and intangible elements binding the African diaspora together also function to deny the reality of the maafa. Such formations undermine movements to demand historical restitution and limit the capacity of cultural criticism to name the workings of destructive processes. Such destructive processes are not limited to incidents of racial violence and historical injustice, but are also found in the realm of cultural discourse where deep-seated cultural anxieties and feelings of supremacy are often reproduced under the subtle guise of the mundane. Thank you. That is all I have.
Thank you very much, Bo Chamberlin. So thank you again for this wonderful presentation. So I think I don't know whether we have questions, but I guess people are still putting together their thoughts, and while they are doing so, I'd like to perhaps you started the thoughts of what it means for somebody to be African. I would like you to expatiate on that, especially in relation to what you have put together here as a Pan-African critique of the Barbarian Logic, and so that's my question. And in just to give you time to put together your thought, I'm reminded of the Greek origin of the concept of barbarian, especially during or after the defeat, the Persians defeated Greeks in, I don't know, around 433 BCE or whatever. And so the Greeks sought to establish their difference. And this is also what I love about, one of the things I love about your topic, that the concept of barbarism has become a kind of signifier for difference. So the Greeks sought to establish their difference and thus their superiority to the Persians by somehow relegating their language and saying their language is a kind of bar, you know. And by the way, in Greece is the birthplace of Logos, and where the barbarians have no access to Logos. So when Africans exercise, or when they deploy their Pan-African or Afrocentric criticism, how are you sure that they are not going to fall back into the pitfall of essentialism? And, you know, so, and that connects to the question of what does it mean to be African?
Thank you. I had a feeling this question was coming. So I think that, you know, it's a complicated issue, the issue of how people identify. And I think that, unfortunately, it's an issue that has often been met more with condemnation and accusations of essentialism. I think that one of the problems with the charge of essentialism is that it has prevented a more sort of full discussion of how cultures evolve and how identities evolve, and how people, the complexity of how people identify themselves and how they are identified by groups of people. And I think that that is one of the things that, you know, I got very deep into some of the origins of German nationalism and doing some of this research. And I think that one of the interesting splits was between a sort of political nationalism in Germany in the 19th century and a sort of use of nation as a philosophical concept. So, you know, as a philosophical concept, it kind of, a lot of the thinking went on to inspire cultural relativism and a lot of critique of Western civilization. And then as a political nationalism, I mean, you can very clearly trace some of the origins of that to Nazi Germany and, you know, white nationalist movements today. And I think that the complexity of the issue is really what I think is so important, that the complexity not be sort of cut off or smushed down. I think that the ability of people to discuss what it means for them personally or for others to be African is something that's important to be able to be recognized in its full complexity, as opposed to something that is always a discussion that's happening on the defensive. Kind of reminds me of, you know, Frantz Fanon talking about the Manichaean condition of colonialism. You know, you have this battle between good and evil, and you automatically put groups into a defensive position. And I think part of the process of liberation should include the ability to have these discussions outside of a defensive position, you know, where somebody is saying, I have to be able to defend my right to identify as an African.
If I may ask, if nobody else is asking yet, so please, everybody, feel free to post your questions, comments, suggestions. Absolutely. Very good presentation, Bo. I very much enjoyed it, especially with the linguistics aspects to it. Just really beautiful. That made me think about the word tribe. And your presentation really brought me to thinking about tribe, the two words, tribe and civilized or uncivilized, as they relate to barbaric behavior, or things you need to change about others so that they are what you think is good based on your own definition of good. And so tribe, I was thinking about the Jutes, Jutes and who were real tribes in Europe, right? Before everybody became civilized, and then other parts of the world were not civilized. And I keep thinking about what moves in terms of identity, what moves people from feeling or being treated as uncivilized? How do you fight so you get out of this concept of civilized / uncivilized, and also tribe, honestly? And I'm not talking about anthropological definitions. I'm talking about societal definitions and a societal identity. How do you fight outside anthropology and outside just really in everyday life? I don't know if I'm making sense with my question.
No, I think it's a question that, again, my answer is not necessarily to have an answer, but to say that I think that, maybe a big part of the answer is just to appreciate the struggles of people to get outside of that dynamic, and to value the space to come up with answers to that question. I think of the the tradition of Kwanzaa, the tradition of Kwanzaa, some people will sometimes say that, Kwanzaa is a made up holiday, because it was created in the 1960s, and, you can very clearly see where it came from. And, but, the reality is it was a holiday that was created along lines of what is the traditional religion? How do we reestablish these connections to a traditional, broader African diasporic spirituality? So it's, and another maybe good example is when you think of people reading very racist anthropological or colonial accounts in order to find a connection to a past that they have, not ever seen, really. That sort of complexity of reading, one's own history is an important part of what it means to be a member of a group. I mean, it's the same thing with the very interesting thing about the concept of barbarians, right, is that the early accounts of European history, when people of German or English or French descent start to look back at their own history and trace their ethnic origins, they start with accounts that were written by outsiders. So all of the historical accounts that became so important in nationalist movements in Europe, they're most of them are written by Greeks and Romans, and often kind of contain a little bit of a stereotypical definition of the people. And so, barbarianism was often invoked in Germany in the 19th century as kind of this is our wild barbarian spirit. And that was something that Romans had projected onto tribesmen in Germany, whether it was true or not. So anyway, my answer is just to have sort of the space that is able to be where people can identify and have that discussion freely and organically.
Thank you.
Okay, I think there's one more question that's reads, according to which conditions we call the nation or member of the groups barbarian, or whose condition? So who decides it? Why the people of Asian origin count as barbarian defined by Western system? So I think you might take a stab on that.
Sure. I think that the answer to who is defined as barbarian is obviously something that somebody is calling. It's changed throughout history. I mean, that was a big part of the point of tracing all of these shifts, these kind of major shifts in defining barbarians, is that it has changed over time. And whereas it meant something semi-specific in the Greek and Roman world, it wasn't really that specific even then. I mean, it was, like was said, based on people who speak an unintelligible language, barbar.
Mm.
So, and it's come to have a similarly unspecific meaning, or an even more unspecific meaning in the post-Enlightenment world. So, and that's kind of where its power lies, actually, is in how unspecific it actually is, while seeming to be something very clear and very specific.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much, Bo Chamberlin. We'll still have many questions, but we are running out of time. And we all deserve at least 5 minutes break to help us stretch and regenerate. And then we're coming back in the next 5 minutes for Christopher Davis' session.